information and limited and precious wisdom. That wisdom is amongst the most critical elements of our storytelling as humans. That idea frames the Street Philosopher Society.
I grew up in this incredible, resilient city called Detroit. You know, if there was ever a metaphor for redemption, Detroit embodies that as a city. I was an honor roll scholarship kid, dreams of being a doctor, and instead I found myself seduced into the crack cocaine trade. And within 3 years of being in that culture, I was shot multiple times, and you know, about 16 months later, I shot and tragically caused a man's death. I was sentenced to 17 to 40 years in prison. I thought my life was over. I realized in that moment how my actions had devastated a family. And I carried that with me into prison. This bitterness, this anger, this confusion. But in that chaos, I discovered the power of the written word. I was reading Socrates' Apology, and it said that unexamined life isn't worth living. I pondered that for a long time before I ever sat down and wrote.
Curiosity, in essence, is you saying, I don't know it all. I am scared. I am angry. I have some guilt. I have some shame. And I wonder what else I can learn.
Then I basically turned a solitary confinement cell into a school of higher learning. That became my monastery. That became my path of academia. That sense of freedom really was born out of this discovery of like the beauty of my mind.
Wisdom comes from lived experience. It takes the willingness of putting yourself out there through your story, your life, and seeing what happens. I met Shaka, and he came and shared a story, and it moved me viscerally. I got him. I felt his soul. And I had this thought over the years. He's a philosopher. He's the real deal.
If you think back to like the idea of ancient philosophy, like it was in the streets. It's early hip hop, breakdancing, it's architecture, you know, street art and independent filmmaking. And like that element of it makes it more accessible.
I believe street philosophers need a frame that can present their ideas on the world stage. And that's what we're here to do.
So we're here in our hometown of Detroit to award our first grants, the home of the true street philosophers.
Success is not guaranteed.
Yeah, success really isn't guaranteed.
Oh my God!
How are you?
Doing well.
Oh, this is amazing. This looks beautiful in here. I always come to bear gifts. And check it out. We love what y'all are doing here. And we just wanted to say thank you.
The Street Philosopher Prize is about wisdom without walls. This is a cash prize with no strings attached. We want you to use the money to amplify in whatever way you see fit your wisdom, your philosophy. So please nominate either yourself or someone that you know, and we offer you a community that you can join to help amplify all street philosophers among us.
Welcome to the stage. Best-selling author, storyteller, and resilience expert Shaka Senghor, and founder, serial entrepreneur, investor, and creator Brad Keywell.
These lovely people.
I want to first set the stage what we're here to do. One is we are announcing the Street Philosopher Society, which we intend to talk about towards the end. What really brings us here in Detroit is an opportunity to have a conversation with a man I believe is one of the real philosophers of this time, and whose lived experience has resulted in a philosophy that we're watching crystallize in real time. So with that, my intention is to have a conversation with Shaka, and then we could talk about Street Philosopher Society. Shaka, I want to talk about your lived experience, which includes 17 years in prison, 7 of which were in solitary confinement. And I want to start with a quote. I want to give you a quote and see what comes up. Blaise Pascal in the 1600s said this: all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. You've sat quietly in a room alone for a long time. What comes up for you when you hear that quote?
What comes up for me is really the differentiation between solitude and solitary confinement. So over the years, when people would marvel at what my life has become post-incarceration, and they discovered that a lot of the transformation took place in solitary confinement, their instinct is to attribute it to that. And those are two distinctly different things. So solitary confinement is one of the most grotesque, brutal, dehumanizing environments imaginable. Solitude, on the other hand, is one of the most graceful spaces that we can find ourselves in, because it gives us the greatest opportunity to get more aligned with our inner being. And so while I was in solitary confinement, I took this solitude journey, a really deep understanding of who I am as a human being, despite the circumstances I was in.
How long did it take to go from solitary confinement to solitude?
It was quite a journey that actually began prior to me being in solitary confinement. And it started with what I always label as one of my miracles that, transpired when I was incarcerated, which was I was introduced to the power of the written word, literature. And, oftentimes when I talk about the impact that literature had on my life, I talk about some of the philosophical things, but none of those things would have existed without books with very scantless titles like Pimp by Iceberg Slim, Dope Fiend by Donald Goins, because those became the kind of pathway toward deeper reading and more purposeful reading. But it was through that understanding of other people's lives that I really began to see the power of what it means to be aligned with yourself in solitude.
So how does it, when you're in prison, you've unlimited, how does it work to get a book? And how does that work?
Yeah, interestingly enough, books can oftentimes be contraband in prison. Actually, two of my books are currently banned in prisons throughout the country because they like to limit the type of information that we read. But back then, the restrictions weren't as prominent. But one of the things that people don't know about that environment, the average reading grade level was like 3rd grade. So I was fortunate to walk in literate. And so I had these incredible mentors.
In prison?
In prison.
And so, and there's a library you could go check out books?
Yes, you can go check out books in the library. Some people have their kind of personal collections, if they're fortunate to have the means by which to purchase them. And so I had a pretty decent library within my cell. And then there's always limitations on how many of anything you have in prison.
So you're in solitary confinement, and I don't know, I think about the idea of solitary confinement and I don't know the right emotion to describe that you can't leave, you can't get out, you have no agency. At what point did you start to be free? And we'll talk about the idea of freedom, but at what point did you start to let go of wanting to do something about it and begin thinking what you can do about this, about yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that's the most destabilizing about being in solitary confinement is that they don't tell you when you're getting out. And as we all know from our experience with the pandemic, part of the anxiety that we experienced was not knowing when the restrictions would end. They would say, hey, you can go back to normal life on May the 7th, and then that didn't happen. And then it becomes August, and then that didn't happen. And so now you're destabilized in such a way where it's hard to kind of put your feet on the ground. And so for me, going into that environment and understanding what it was designed to do, There's a book called Cages of Steel that I had read, and the psychiatrist outlined exactly what happens to a human being when you put them in isolation. And because I was aware of what was supposed to happen, it allowed me to have a little bit more agency over how I thought about that experience. And through reading books about, mastering your thinking, the ability to fall in love with your own mind. And that, for me, that was the true unlock, was like, I began to explore my mind in ways that I hadn't done prior to being in prison.
What the books, just quickly, the books taught you that what is supposed to happen? It's supposed to take away what?
Yeah, so it's supposed to take away your agency. If you're in there long enough, it stops, it interrupts your ability to communicate. Because in order to talk to your neighbor, you gotta lay on the floor and holler up under the door. You start to hallucinate when you're in that environment. I guess it's designed to make you hallucinogenic. Not in like the mushroom or acid way, but like in a very, a way that's really designed to make you question what is happening, right? It's a very chaotic environment.
Even though you're alone, it's chaotic.
Yeah, because even though you're alone in a cell, you're still on a cell block. And so if somebody is having a mental breakdown and they're banging on their locker, for example, it echoes through that environment.
Destabilizing. And so you read books that taught you that this is the purpose of what you're experiencing.
Absolutely.
And by rising above, you decided for yourself that the purpose is what?
So I decided that the purpose for me was to really understand what was my purpose in life. And that came about through journaling. And really, whenever I would find myself in those moments where, what was happening around me was so chaotic, I really focused on what was happening inside of me. And so I would journal and I would write about my experience. I would write about how I feel, what I thought. And I would question, like, how did I even end up here? And that allowed me to gain some sense of stability and to really kind of orient myself around what did I want to happen with my life.
It strikes me when we met, 10 years ago, and just meeting you, feeling your soul moved me deeply. And reflecting on your life and your story, what I start to realize is all of life is stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, stories that we hear about others, ways that we read about others and digest that story. It seems like you rewrote your story during the story. It's quite. Was there anyone else around you that you experienced in those 17 years that you believe had the same grounding, or do you feel like, why do you think you're so fortunate to have an understanding about what was happening to you versus just being at the effect of what's happening to you?
I think I was really lucky. I think being literate was like, a gift. It was an unexpected gift. Just being literate in that environment, being curious about life, and really examining how I got there. So going back to narrative. So I grew up in the city of Detroit. Welcome you all to our city. And I grew up in an environment where the level of gun violence was unimaginable. In my family alone, at least 10 of us have been shot.
10 people in your family have been shot?
Yes.
Okay.
My mother has 3 sons. All 3 of us have been shot. My second oldest brother's been shot twice. He's currently paralyzed. And so growing up in that environment and you hear that you will be dead or in jail before you're 21, like that was the narrative that I inherited, and that was the narrative that I began to live my life by. And so when I was in solitary, I talked about this one quote that became so powerful in my life: the unexamined life isn't worth living. And so when I began examining my life, it started with this essential question of how did I go from this kid with dreams of being a doctor to serving out my most promising years in prison. And that's when I began to write and began to understand that the narrative that led me there was a narrative that I inherited. It wasn't the true essence of who I was as a human being. And so I just began to uncover who I am authentically. And that's when I started to really reimagine my life, and that's when I started to feel this sense that my freedom wasn't contingent upon where I was at, it was contingent upon what I thought.
And this is while you're in solitary with a theoretical possibility of not leaving the four walls of a prison for way beyond 17 years, right? I mean,
Yeah. Well, it was actually a total of 19 years, so I was sentenced to 17 to 40 years, but I served a total of 19 years. And, you know, what I've since discovered post-incarceration is that prisons exist everywhere. You know, people in this room sitting right here amongst us right now are likely to have hidden prisons that, you know, minimize the opportunities that exist in their day-to-day life. And once I discovered that, I just began to reimagine what that cell was. And I shifted the way that I thought about the cell. It went from being a place that was intended to cause me harm to a place that I turned into a space of higher learning.
let me ask you this. Did you ever experience joy in solitary confinement?
You know, it's so interesting about when you think about prison and the stories that's told about prison, all we hear is about just the brutality, the harm, and all those things are true. So two things. One is that you can't get through such harsh, barbaric environment without a sense of humor.
Sense of humor.
Yeah, and so prison, surprisingly, is probably one of the most humorous environments you can imagine because the wit of the people who are held captive is a tool by which they use to navigate the harshness of the environment. And, you know, some of you may have read Man's Search for Meaning, and it talks about how humor, you know, aided, you know, people in surviving the Holocaust. And so for me, joy, I first experienced joy when I literally fell in love with my mind. I began to spend intentional time thinking and imagining and, you know, kind of visualizing, you know, the life that I wanted to live. It's one of the things I do to this day, and it's one of the things that brings me the deepest sense of satisfaction and the deepest sense of joy.
To provide, for those who have not spent time reading Shaka's words or with Shaka personally, post-prison, Shaka wrote just a profound book called Writing My Wrongs, W-R-I-T-I-N-G, which to me talked about the what of your experience with some why, but a lot of what. You then were seen by a lot of people who read those words, and my story is they saw you as a deeply soulful man in this world, and part of seeing you let them see themselves. You then wrote a book of letters, letters that were fundamentally written to your sons and to all of us, which also moved me. And you've now written a book, and I see that the first one was a lot of what, little why. The second book was more why and more perhaps how to live. You've now written a book called How to Be Free. And it really is about the why. It's almost like we're watching an artist get to a masterpiece. Talk about that idea of freedom.
Yeah. You know, in about 2 weeks, I'll be celebrating 15 years on this side of the prison walls. And so thank you. And the idea of freedom is something that's just so present in every aspect of my life because it's the thing that I fight for in my own life. I love to anything that's structured stresses me out. And so creatively, like I write without structure. I don't have a specific time that I get up in the morning. I write on planes, trains, and random places. But it's rooted in this idea that we become the best version of ourselves when we have complete agency over our lives. And what I found is that as we get deeper into our lives, we tend to give up more of our agency. We give up joy for whatever the current news cycle is. We give up the idea of fulfillment because we feel like we have to fit within some type of structured model of perfection. We give up process and when it comes to creativity because we're always thinking about the end result versus the actual experience that we're in. And so for me, being super present and being mindful in every aspect of my life gives me this greatest sense of what it means to be free. How I think about my experiences, how I think about how I feel, being able to make a choice when something is disruptive to that, and realizing that it always comes back to me. And like that part of freedom is what I want to make sure that other people have access to. And it's also understanding what are the things that lock us in place. And, you know, for example, there's not a person in this room, as Dan Gilbert talked about yesterday, that'll get through life without grief. Every one of us will go through it. Every one of us will lose someone, we'll lose a job, we'll lose a love, we'll lose our sense of identity and our way of being. And we'll find ourselves in this grief in a way that doesn't allow us to be joyful, fulfilled, purposeful, and successful. And what I found is that if you can release yourself from that, which is one of the toughest prisons to get out of, and the reason it's one of the toughest prisons to get out of because it would be cruel to say to someone, hey, you should stop grieving. You've grieved long enough.
So you gotta find a way out of it or a way to incorporate it within something else on your own.
Absolutely. And so for me, like grief turned into gratitude, you know, being thankful for the moments had, thankful for the moments lost, thankful for the people had, thankful for the people lost. And like that shifted my whole perspective around what it means to grieve and what it means to actually be free and have real agency over those experiences.
You talk about hidden prisons. One framework I use is that there's capital trauma T and there's lowercase t. A lowercase t, I believe, often results in a prison that has one wall, and we stare at it all the time. So we believe that we're looking at bars we can't get out. But you can go that way, or that way, you just don't. You're looking straight ahead, and it's a prison, whether it's a relationship, whether it's anger or resentment. You're just going at it over and over, banging against bars. Capital T trauma might be analogized as all four walls. I mean, it's really hard to figure out a way out. How do you think about that idea of being either within bars, which you've experienced, or being out in the world but still have this idea that there's something that you can't do? You're stuck.
I think the bars that people experience when they've never been in an actual prison are amongst some of the most tragic. You know, when I move through life, as I do, I've met people from every social strata, class, gender, race, identity. And the greatest tragedy is to see someone give up their agency because they've imprisoned themselves around the idea of what life is, or that they can't move on from a thing, or that they can't get away from a trauma that no longer exists. So I grew up in an abusive household, and at one point in my life, I shaped my whole identity around the traumatic events in my life. And I realized that I was replaying over and over things that, one, no longer existed, two, that I had no control over, and three, that I was not responsible for. And so when I would journal, I went back and reassigned responsibility to those who caused harm instead of internalizing that. And once I realized that that was the escape route, you know, I was like, wow, you can do this in every aspect of your life, but you have to want it. And sometimes, sadly and tragically, we are rewarded for staying in prison. And in this very kind of self-fulfilling way of like, if I can lean into victimhood, someone will pay attention to me. Versus if I define myself outside of these bars I've created, I can actually become a new person and see life in a new way.
Let me shift this a little bit. One of the many remarkable things about Shaka is soon after, I don't know the right way to say it, you were out of prison free? Like, I don't know, what's the right way to say it? Soon after you were
Paroled.
You were here in Detroit, I believe, and somebody came to speak who's another Detroiter, Joey Ito, who was the head of the MIT Media Lab, and he gave a talk. And somebody asked a question, and after the talk, Joey said, hey, you've got, and I asked Joey what he saw in Shaka, and he said, the man had a spark. So Joey and Shaka start talking, and long story short, Joey says, hey Shaka, I know you just got paroled. I would love you to be one of the fellows at the MIT Media Lab.
Yeah.
Shortly after you were paroled.
Yeah.
What did you learn by being amongst what I believe is one of the most extraordinary places of thinkers in anywhere, okay? That's how special the MIT Media Lab is.
Yeah.
What was one thing that you learned from that experience so soon after you were behind bars?
I would say the thing that I learned that stuck with me more than anything from my experience at MIT Media Lab was that genius occurs anywhere. And what I mean by that is when I walked into MIT Media Lab, I was 20 years in prison, so I missed a whole technology movement. So I was in prison when the internet happened. I was in prison when social media happened. And the way I describe it is like, imagine Fred Flintstone stepping into episodes of the Jetsons. So that's what it was like for me going to MIT Media Lab.
I'm sure, at an extreme.
Yeah. And I found myself very out of place and very intimidated until I began to realize that what was happening to define genius in that environment was there was space created for iteration, exploration, and failure. And that the way that genius was defined was dictated by the environment. And here's what I mean. So shortly after that, I did a prison hack at MIT Media Lab. I don't know if Joey told you this, but basically I came up with 5 design challenges based on problems we had to solve in prison. So for example, I gave them a tape player, an ink pen, and some newspaper for them to create a tattoo gun. And I gave them
a tape
player.
Tape
so like
player.
an old school tape player.
Like a cassette tape player.
Cassette player, an ink pen.
An ink pen and newspaper. To create a tattoo gun.
A tattoo gun and ink. Because that's how we would do it in prison. And then I gave them like these other challenges. One was what's called a stinger, is how we would heat water up. We would take an extension cord, basically cut it up with some nail clippers, attach the nail clippers to it, and then you use that to heat up water. And I gave them the challenge of making a fish line, which was how we communicated. You basically take a toothpaste tube, squeeze all the toothpaste out, attach that to the yarn that you pulled out of your socks or your underwear. I typically use my socks because I like to keep my drawers on, especially in prison. And then we would slide that from cell door to cell door to communicate. And so I gave them about 3 hours to complete all these challenges. They couldn't complete any of them. In fact, we blew the power out at MIT Media Lab. A couple of people, and another challenge was for them to create a lighter. They burnt their fingers trying to create the lighter. And I had 2 ideas there. One was I wanted them to be able to explain the science behind what was happening, but I also wanted to prove that there are people sitting in prison right now who are just as capable, just as intelligent, just as able. They just are in a very different environment. So if they would have completed those tasks at MIT Media Lab, they're touted as a genius. When you complete those tasks in prison, you get put in solitary confinement because you're technically breaking the rules. And so that shifted my whole perspective of what it means to be genius and the impact that environment plays in defining who is smart and who isn't.
Yeah, you know, Warren Buffett talks about the genetic lottery of being born in America. Just alone, that's you're among the luckiest on earth.
Yeah.
The experience of we all happen to have the families that we have, and our families happen to have the traumas that they've had, and that generational trauma leads to whatever frustrations it does for our parents, and they do whatever they do. and here we are. And I just have so much empathy, and I don't know, it helps provide some, you help provide some reflection on the reality that we don't choose our parents, we don't choose our lives, yet we live with them and the circumstances that happen to us.
Absolutely.
I want to shift again to what's a conversation, I think, of the moment, which is men and boys, wise elders. How are we raising men in our society? I know you've got strong opinions about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, you know, when I think about what it means to be a man in current society, it's very complex. You know, the narrative around what emotions men have access to and the harm that that has caused. You know, one of the emotions that men are free to express is anger. In fact, you know, there's a ton of pride, you know, when you can be as angry as possible. And it's exalted in such a way that it's caused incredible harm to how we develop relationships as friends, how we develop intimate romantic relationships, our parenting relationships. And, you know, one of the things that I write about in the latest book is what I think is one of the most incredible unlocks for any man. And that's the willingness and ability to be vulnerable. And
what does vulnerability look like?
It means being okay with saying that I'm not okay. It means being okay to say that I desire love and peace and that I'm emotionally available to those who are in my life.
And just for the sake of digging into this, so how do we start to change? What's one idea of how to start to change things practically? Because our school system is about conformity. You know, there's no manual about how to be a parent.
Yeah.
Role models are not, you know, are not all over the place. What do we do?
I think it just starts with each of us, like, just having an agreement to making a courageous step. And so what I've discovered in my own friendships with the men in my life is that my deep friendships are because we create space to be emotionally vulnerable. We create space to say, I don't know, I don't have it all figured out. I lean on my friends when it comes to fatherhood. I lean on my friends when it comes to relationships. And the beauty of being that emotionally vulnerable with the men in my life is like unmatched in terms of like the joy that I get from that. And I think the one thing we can do is begin to exalt that. We've exalted this very, you know, barbaric culture of, you know, how desensitized I can be as a leader as being like the holy grail of what it means to be a great CEO. And I think we're starting to see a shift to where people are realizing like that old model is not the best model and that you can create new models, but it has to, and I just, in honesty, I know that I have a hack, right? So I know when I'm emotionally vulnerable with other men, like I have a hack because I've been through the toughest things you can be through. I've been through prison, I've been shot, so I've done all the masculine things. So they're more likely to receive vulnerability from me in a very different way. And I leverage that. You know, I'm just like, look, I've been through the tough things, and it's not a pleasurable space to be. Love is much more enjoyable. Being present, being fulfilled in life, like those things are much more valuable.
Perhaps what you're talking about, well,
Yeah.
I'll say, what I hear you talking about is a version of the hero's journey, and there is a role for those who have experienced it. There's an important role for those that have experienced it to come back to the theoretical village.
Absolutely.
And teach, help, guide, mentor others.
Absolutely.
Perhaps mentorship is, I know mentorship is part of the formula. How have you seen mentorship be institutionalized? Is there any way to take mentorship and make it more of a thing so people like you can be more present, can be more present in communities that really don't have a lot of role models?
Yeah, you know, I think there is a model that works. You know, it usually takes people who just have a ton of courage. I remember when I was actually living here in Detroit, I adopted 2 high schools here. And what a lot of people didn't know is that legally I wasn't supposed to be in those high schools because I have a felony. There are so many barriers to just everyday life that people don't think about when you have a felony, but because I have a felony, I wasn't supposed to be in those high schools. But it was a courageous principal, it was a courageous dean who was like, you know what? The hell with those rules. We see the value you add to these kids. We see that these boys light up when you walk into the room. They open up in ways that we just, hadn't seen before. And I think it's through those type of courageous efforts that we shift what it means. I've been doing this work a long time in criminal justice. There was a time when it was no way possible that I would be sitting here on this stage in this room right now. And the fact that I'm here is a testament to the power of storytelling. It's a testament to the power of people saying, we're not gonna hold you hostage for the rest of your life to a moment in time, a tragic moment, but it was a moment in time. It's not the entirety of your life.
Yeah.
And so what I would say is that everybody in this room has an opportunity to be courageous in your own lives, in proximity to the people that you're around, the people that you connect with, the people that work for you, the people that you do business with, to challenge, to push. And I think if we do that, we just create a better world.
With that, I want to open this frame a little bit around a conversation that Shaka and I had about a year ago, when I really believe in philosophy as a complement, as a North Star. Let's say it might stand side by side with religion. For some, it might be their religion, a philosophy. And it dawned on me that what I know about in terms of organizations that recognize philosophers are generally, if not universally, focused on philosophers with a capital P that come out of academics, that are PhDs and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And I called Shock and I said, hey man, I'm just sitting there thinking, these big, they should be awarding you and people like you with prizes. We should be framing stories like yours around what are the lessons beyond a book about your story. What is the why?
Yeah.
What is that abstracted why that might have some tangible value that really goes beyond this day and goes to all days? And that led me to saying to Shaka, let's start something called the Street Philosopher Society.
Yeah.
And why don't you take it from there?
Yeah, so over the course of my work, I've been nominated for a few different prizes, including I've been nominated for a TED Prize, which is $1 million prize. I was one of 20 finalists. I was nominated, which was really the spark for this conversation, for the Berggruen Prize, which was $1 million prize, and we had a profound conversation about what that means to go through this process, knowing that these institutions would never recognize someone with my background and my experience. And we started just talking about who's sharing wisdom in the world today. Who are these people who get boxed out of these conversations and who will never, get a MacArthur Genius Grant or things of that nature, even though they have all the markings of that. And so we decided to build it. And I know you got a chance to see the incredible video that we showed. And we actually have some of our Detroit philosophers here today that we were excited to honor. I think Sarah and Jay is back there. If you can raise your hand. Then we have Sean Wilson over here on this side. We have Clement Brown over here in the front. And so the big idea is that, in communities globally, there are people who are sharing wisdom that we all benefit from. Some of these, philosophical people are more well-known than others. And then some of them we are just discovering, and we're excited to have you all join us on that journey to help us discover and to, award and acknowledge these incredible contributions so that we can really build a community around the preservation of wisdom, knowledge, and insights. And so that's how we landed here, and we're super excited to see where we take it to.
I would add to that, there's such joy in, my life has been building companies generally, and that idea of going from 0 to 1, and the idea of the unknown, and the capacity to create something that you believe needs to exist, but doesn't. And to do it together has opened my mind and my heart and so much of my imagination. And part of where we are at this early moment of the Street Philosopher Society is we don't know exactly what it's going to be.
Right.
What we do know are some fundamental principles, that what we stand for is identifying and acknowledging and awarding with recognition, we hope, that magnifies, and also with money that can be used in any way that the recipient wants. That act of identifying the philosophers from the streets has value, has meaning. And we found ourselves reflecting on what is philosophy. Well, the earliest Greek philosophers, at least, I know that there's Far Eastern philosophy that much predates our Western philosophy, but the Greek philosophers came from the streets. They were people that talked, they told stories, they reflected on their experience and their observations of the community. They did not come from some academic institution and tell us what we should be thinking.
Absolutely.
And I think that sort of informs this idea.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that's so incredible is when we actually begin to really think deeply about it. Wisdom is always found amongst the people. You know, it's in the barber shops, it's in the hair salons, it's in the art museums, it's in spaces where we inhabit, it's over dinner, it's over cocktail. And, you know, to be able to go back and drink from that well over and over and over again, I think it's one of the most precious gifts we can give ourselves and others.
And the idea of a recognition that, you know, what we hope to be building in Street Philosopher Society will have magnification power, will help those that are street philosophers, help them magnify maybe their unknown philosophy, their wisdom that they're actually living, but perhaps we unlock them to think bigger, to think more broadly and more impactfully on a societal basis. And the idea of having a cash prize with no strings attached, I think, has a certain power to it.
Absolutely.
I mean, how do you think about the idea of that cash prize, in essence, trusting the recipient to do whatever they want?
Yeah, I think it's amazing. I think it's amazing in this sense. Oftentimes, the way that these prizes are allocated, it's almost as if these institutions distrust people who the community has already established a high level of trust with. And I think to disrupt that in a way to just say, you know what, the fact that we even found you or you were brought to us speaks volumes about the integrity of what it is that you've given birth to, and why disrupt that by creating some, you know, unknown fear that has nothing to do with what you've already created in the world, and why don't we just honor that? And so that's, I think, is the important thing.
One of the things that struck me about your choice of title for the book that's coming out is the use of the word be.
Yeah.
You know, one framework that I believe has had such value for me is, you know, how do we live? Do we live a life where things are happening to us as a victim? Do we live a life things are happening by us, which is like a hero life, which has its own unconscious toxicity?
Absolutely.
Do we live a life where things are happening through us? Now we're starting to get into some flow where we're actually a channel for goodness. Or do we live a life at the highest level where things are happening as us? We just are. We just are. There's an isness about being alive, just a beingness.
Yeah.
Why did you choose how to be free? What's that idea about the action of being free?
Yeah. You know, when I was thinking about the book title, and one of my favorite things about my writing journey is that I've chosen all my own book titles. I didn't have like some random person be like, you should name it this, you should decide this, is it started from thinking about my experience when I'm flying. So I travel a lot and I always choose a window seat. And it's one of the most incredible spaces for me to be physically in the world is up in the clouds and realizing how small we are comparative to the things that we magnify in our lives. The problems that we think we have when you're up there in the clouds seem so minute. And what I've learned from my experience of traveling and being in the clouds is the complete presence that I have when I'm in those spaces. And how fulfilling that it feels to like really be present in my body, to be present in my mind, and to be present in my spirit. And to me, that's the ultimate freedom, is that mindfulness of like, I am because I am.
You've mentioned a couple books in this conversation. A Man's Search for Meaning and, well, that one stuck out for me. What book do you think, other than yours, we all need to read?
I would say my go-to when I have to think of all the books to recommend is James Allen, As a Man Thinketh.
Great.
It's just one of my favorite books about the exploration of the mind. So,
And tell us what As a Man Thinketh by James Allen, what is that? Give us a handful of sentences about why that book is so powerful. What does it say to you?
yeah, you know, there's a passage in the book when James talks about envisioning your mind as a garden, and what you plant and you nurture grows. And like that visual imagery was something that was so profound in my life. And it really helped me think about what am I taking in? What am I consciously, consuming? And it just made me hyper aware of just the power and the beauty of mind.
It's rare that we are in the presence of real earned experience, earned philosophy. And being in the presence of a true philosopher whose life experience shaped precise insight is really something, Shaka. And you mentioned Man's Search for Meaning. The idea of going through hardship and it meaning something. And hardship helping you shape the meaning of things. So both meaning for you and helping you think about what do things mean. You mentioned social media, you mentioned freedom, you mentioned agency and choice, you mentioned grief and the capacity and motivation to feel deeply with other people, other men, to share, give back, pay forward. I just want you to know that you inspire me. You've inspired me since I met you. You continue to inspire me. You inspire me right now. And the Street Philosopher Society, as an act that we are creating to try to identify those who inspire others, and to take all of our energy and all of our imagination and channel it through others to help them be amplified, help them tell their stories in a big way, to be with you on this brand new journey, to be a co-creator with you of something so special is one of the honors of my life. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in appreciating Shaka Senghor.
Truly an honor.